The cargo plane soared above a sea of clouds, its engines humming steadily like a distant heartbeat in the cabin. Captain Derek Mills sat behind the controls, his posture confident, his gaze fixed on the altimeter and the digital readouts flickering. Across the panel, he had flown hundreds of missions in war zones, in humanitarian corridors, in remote terrain. But today was routine, just another supply run across mid-continent at altitude. He glanced at the co-pilot charting their route on a tablet. Beside him, the sun slanted through the windows, casting sharp lines of light across instrument faces, giving everything a surreal glow. Below them lay thousands of feet of empty sky and turbulent pressure zones. They were alone together in that chamber. Of metal and fuel beyond lay the echoing void. But Derek felt calm, warm adrenaline steady in his veins. He reached for his radio knob to check in with ground control when a slight twinge flickered across his vision as if a steel curtain had brushed. His eyes, twice he blinked, and the dials seemed to tilt and sway. He shook his head as though clearing sleep. From the corner of his eye, he saw the co-pilot looking at him alarmed. The co-pilot spoke, but Derek barely heard the words. He felt sweat bead at his hairline, a sudden pressure behind his eyes as though some invisible hand were pressing inward. His breathing shortened. His hand moved toward his chest. His fingers trembled. His forearms spasmed. The flight deck seemed too bright, too loud. The hum of engines soared into his ears, and the hum of systems pulsed and drowned out logic. The co-pilot reacted, screaming his name. Derek tried to answer, but his throat felt locked. His vision tunneled. The last thing he saw was the altimeter spinning, wildly. Then darkness claimed him. The cockpit alarms shattered silence. They burst into life across panels, light and sound, cascading like alarms in a fortress compound. The co-pilot lurched in his seat, jolted his hands flailing to counter the angular momentum. The plane jolted violently as controls dropped. The aural chaos stabbed through the cabin wall. The crew jolted from seats in the rear. Scramble lights flickered. The flight attendants gripped overhead rails, crying out in fear. Passengers jolted forward. Some let out gasps, and panicked murmurs traveled down the aisles like wildfire. The plane pitched downward for a heartbeat, then leveled just enough to remind everyone how fragile they were, miles above Earth First Officer Reynolds. Lunged across the console, sliding his body into the vacated chair. Derek's body lay slumped across, controls limp, unresponsive. The co-pilot rolled aside, trying to regain his own balance. The cockpit instrument lights danced erratically. Every indicator screamed anomaly, fuel flow wavered, hydraulics jittered, altitude warnings flickered, and the vertical speed gauge plunged steeply, then jerked back upward as if it resisted its own fate. Reynolds pressed buttons, tried override commands, tried to steady the descent, but the systems resisted like a wounded beast refusing permission. Below them, the silent ocean of clouds folded and billowed, unknown. The aircraft lurched, a trembling oscillation as turbulence gripped the wings. The crew in the cabin clung to seats braced for impact. The cargo jolted loose in places. The crate latches groaned. A sharp thud echoed somewhere amid the hold. The plane bucked again in the back. The flight attendant Miriam heard the shriek of alarms and rose from her. "Jump seat!" She brushed past frightened passengers, telling them to stay calm. Her voice trembled but firm. She glanced down the aisle at the man in seat 11C. The man sat upright, hands in his lap, unreadable face turned slightly away. His posture was straight, composed, as though he had expected something like this. He did not flinch under the sudden violent motion. His eyes remained steady and fixed on the front of the plane. He made no move to brace himself, nor did he glance about. He was utterly still in the chaos around him. Miriam's breath caught. She wondered who he was. What assignment had brought him aboard this lightly manned flight? Reynolds fought battles with the aircraft. He toggled stabilizer switches. He masked alarms. He forced power to alternate systems. He tried to radio ground control, but lines were busy or blocked. He attempted to send a mayday call, but static choked the transmission. The engines moaned under strain. The fuselage vibrated. Metal groaned. The cabin shuddered. Reynolds glanced at his hands smeared on the control yoke slick with sweat. His heart hammered in his chest. He turned and called to the back crew, telling them to prepare for worst. The flight attendants scrambled, instructing passengers to secure harnesses. The cabin lights flickered, sending the interior into wavering gloom. The passengers gasped, cried, some prayed. Others cursed the sudden violence of fate. Miriam edged forward, clinging to a seat back. She passed row after row, her voice barely audible. But she noticed something odd. Many in the cabin stared straight ahead, blank-faced, some twisted with fear, but few tried to stand or flee. The mysterious man in 11C remained unmoved, as though the storms above and the chaos around were part of his plan. His gaze flicked briefly at one terrified passenger who trembled, then returned to his fixed view ahead. His hands shifted, and he whispered to himself, just loud enough for Miriam to catch a fragment of a word she could not place. Reynolds pressed his knee into a console, his muscles screaming. He tried override autopilot. He grounded his fingers over the fuel cutoff lever, but the lever hesitated to respond. At that moment, a piercing jolt shook the plane, dropping it several hundred feet in seconds like a stone in water. Passengers screamed. The cargo hold behind him rattled, heavy crates shifting. The plane groaned like an animal in pain. The instrumentation flickered black for a moment, then came alive erratically, flicking gauges. Randomly, the engines whined unsteady. Reynolds realized they were losing altitude fast. The altimeter read alarming descent. They had to regain control quickly or crash into the clouds below. He looked toward the mysterious passenger again. The man in 11C rose at last, as if awakened from a trance. He stood slowly, each move deliberate. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something rectangular in shape. The object gleamed faintly in the errant cabin light. Reynolds thought it a smartphone or some communication device. He stepped forward, his stride measured. The turbulence forced him to steady himself against the seat back, but he placed one hand on the aisle armrest and the other on his coat as though steadying an invisible load. Miriam froze mid-step, her eyes fixed on him. He leaned forward toward the front of the cabin from his vantage point. His voice carried strangely, though the roar. He said 3 simple words that cut through the chaos as though they were a scalpel. Into flesh. The cockpit crew froze at the sound. The cabin held its breath. The engines roared and alarms screamed, but in that instant the world stilled. Time paused. The passengers clutched their seats, unable to look away. He spoke again. Words, no. Mortal was meant to utter through cabin intercom voice or direct voice, no one could tell. The 3 words echoed in the ears of crew and passengers alike. The value of those words lay not in their content, but in what they implied. A command, a claim, a revelation. Reynolds heard them, and his blood went cold. He could not believe what those words meant, but he recognized them from a past he had tried to forget. The mysterious man advanced through the aisle toward the cockpit door, his steps surer than the chaotic motion of the plane. The door between cabin and cockpit strained under shifting pressure. The man pressed his palm against its surface for balance. His voice repeated the words quietly, yet the impact shook everything. Reynolds felt a magnetic compulsion to shut him out, to slam the door, to barricade the flight deck. But he hesitated because the words had unlocked something primordial in him, an echo of protocol, of compliance, of fear and respect. The cockpit door blinked open. As though pulled by those words, he turned to glance at Derek's limp form, then shifted back to face the encroaching man. At the same time, the engines lurched. The plane pitched again, dipping sharply, causing everyone to lurch. Their stomachs flipped. The floor shuddered. The cabin lights dimmed momentarily. The wings groaned. The fuselage strained under stress. The man in 11C entered the cockpit threshold. The co-pilot tried to resist, sliding sideways. His hands gripped panels but trembling motion. Betrayed desperation. The man raised his free hand and gestured Reynolds to make room. His face was calm, inscrutable. The lighting flickered through the cockpit, casting strange shadows across his features, like a mask of half-revealed truth. He moved, past Reynolds into the front seat. Derek's seat, but Reynolds tried to protest, his voice stuck in his throat. The man settled into the seat behind the yoke prematurely as though claiming it by right. The plane bucked. He steadied himself. He placed his hands over the control yoke, but not touching it yet. He tilted his head back and stared at the display screens as though greeting old friends. Reynolds faced him, eyes wild with questions, mouth opening to shout, but nothing emerged. The man's hand brushed against a panel, flicking on standby systems with smooth precision. The cockpit lights dimmed, then restored in a wash of green glow. The alarms dropped slightly in pitch. The plane steadied momentarily. The descent rate slackened. The rapid drop slowed. The chaos around them hushed somewhat, not relieved but held at bay. Suspense pulsed like a living thing in the narrow chamber in the cabin below. Miriam's voice cracked over the intercom, calling out to passengers, telling them to remain calm, to brace for impact, to pray. She watched over her shoulder at the cockpit threshold. The stranger's silhouette framed by the blinking lights looked impossible. He seemed larger than life. In that frame, as though destiny itself had walked aboard, the passengers exchanged whispers. Some saw recognition, others horror. The crates behind rattled again. The cabin rocked. The plane groaned, futurity hanging as a weight between them. Reynolds' gaze locked on the man in the front seat. His mind raced with questions. Why him? Who was he? What authority commanded him to intervene? What secret had brought him here now? The strange words he had uttered still echoed in his ears like a cryptic code. The mysterious passenger leaned forward as though preparing to speak, but he paused, letting the silence lengthen, pressing it against every ear in that confined space. His eyes flicked toward Derek's body, then toward Reynolds. Then he opened his mouth to speak words that would reshape the fate of everyone aboard and bind them desperately to the next moment. The silence grew heavy and pregnant, with dread. Reynolds could not breathe for a moment as he stared at the man now seated in the command chair. The stranger with a face carved from stone, a presence too steady, too composed for the chaos swirling around them. The engines still screamed and the alarms pulsed red in sharp flashes across every surface. But the stranger moved with precision, not haste, not panic. His fingers danced across the flight panel like a pianist touching keys. Long memorized, his eyes scanned the displays as if reading a language no one else on board could understand. And then he spoke again, only louder. This time, using a voice that carried weight not just in volume but in gravity. He said, "The plane is mine now." And Reynolds flinched because it did not sound like arrogance. It sounded like fact. The stranger reached up and flicked two switches on. The overhead panel initiating auxiliary control protocols, not used in standard civilian flight, but embedded deep in military design. Something Reynolds barely remembered from years of training and even deeper years of suppression. He watched helplessly. As the systems responded to the man's touch, the autopilot re-engaged under a new command layer. The descent angle shifted slightly, nose lifting like an animal resisting submission. The stranger exhaled and the plane began to level slowly, carefully, not fully, but enough to pull them out of the critical descent. Reynolds tried to speak again, demanded to know who he was, but before the words could leave his throat, the man turned and gave a name. Not one he expected, not a civilian name. Not even a rank, but a call sign, Phantom 6. The co-pilot's mouth dried instantly, because Phantom 6 was not supposed to be alive. Phantom 6 was a myth. A story passed around in the dark hangars between rotations. A ghost pilot, a black ops operative who had disappeared during a high-risk extraction operation in the Kunar province nearly a decade ago. Everyone knew the tale. The explosion, the wreckage, the signal lost the funeral without a body. They said he had saved 25 lives and died a hero. They said the mission was erased from records, classified and buried. They said no one walked away from what he walked into. But here he was now sitting inches away, calm, steady, and speaking codes that were not only valid, but buried deep in. The security systems of the aircraft Phantom 6 reached into the armrest storage and pulled out a headset with a gold rim around the earpiece. A restricted model issued only to Tier 1 operatives. He placed it over his ear and thumbed the mic. He spoke into it with a cold efficiency, requesting uplink through satellite channel Echo 9, confirming override and identifying himself with a string of alphanumeric clearance, so deep, so layered, it took 10 seconds to recite Reynolds could. Not understand half of it, but the response that came through the comm was instant, encrypted, and terrifyingly respectful. "Welcome back, sir," was all it said. The turbulence had not stopped, but the tone of the cockpit changed. The alarms now no longer screamed, they murmured like whispers, acknowledging his command. Reynolds finally forced himself to speak, demanding again. "Who are you? How are you here? How do you know this aircraft?" And Phantom 6 answered without looking up. "I built it." The words crashed into Reynolds like a wall, because that statement rewrote everything he knew about this flight, this plane, its mission, its design. If what he said was true, then this was no ordinary cargo run, no standard supply chain. The aircraft was military, grade outfitted for dual operations but disguised as civilian transport, and that meant the contents in the hold might not be routine at all. Reynolds turned his head slowly toward the manifest screen, but the data there was partially encrypted. Flagged under authority, he could not access Phantom 6, kept speaking quietly, confirming course corrections, overriding fail-safes, engaging stealth transponder modes that Reynolds had only seen activated once in simulations, the kind used to disappear. From civilian radar below them, the passengers remained in frightened silence, but some had noticed the change, not just in altitude but in atmosphere. Miriam stood midway down the aisle, gripping the jump seat rail with one hand and staring toward the cockpit, her instincts screaming that something far beyond their pay grade was unfolding before them. She saw the cabin lights stabilize, felt the engines hum, shift tone, and knew someone had taken over, someone who was not part of the manifest, the man from 11C, the one no one had spoken to, the one who had remained quiet through boarding and takeoff and hours of silent flight, was now flying the plane, and somehow the plane seemed to listen to him more than it had ever listened to any of them. Miriam began moving slowly down the aisle, careful not to startle the passengers who now clung to their armrests, not from motion, but from fear of the unknown. She passed rows of eyes wide with terror and confusion, the murmurs rising now like smoke through a crumbling building, people asking what happened to the captain. "Who is that man? Why are we turning?" She reached the cockpit door and froze as it opened by itself, as if expecting her. The lights inside bathed the small space in a greenish glow. Co-pilot looked, pale eyes flicking between her and the stranger, who was now speaking again to someone on the other end of the encrypted channel. "We have compromised cargo on board," he said. "Compromised personnel, too. Probable hostile embedded in manifest. And we are not alone." Reynolds spun toward him. "What do you mean?" "Not alone," he asked. But Phantom 6 only tapped the radar. Console zoomed out. The screen revealed a second aircraft on a collision intercept vector 30 miles out. No transponder, no flight plan. No communication, unmarked, said Phantom 6 and hostile. The reality struck Reynolds like a strike to the chest. Not only was their captain down and their aircraft hacked, but they were now being pursued, possibly targeted by something or someone who knew exactly what was in the hold. Miriam stepped forward, voice low. "What is in the cargo?" she asked. Phantom 6 turned for the first time, meeting her eyes directly with a gaze that did not blink, and said, classified, but dangerous enough, that someone is willing to bring this plane down before it lands, and I need your help to stop that from happening. She stared back at him, trying to decide whether he was insane or the only person on board who actually knew what was going on below. Deck in the cargo bay sealed tight behind reinforced doors. Sensors activated silently, without alerting the cockpit. Something stirred within one of the containers, a blinking light previously dormant. Now pulsing with life, a soft vibration echoed. Through the floor panels of the plane, no one heard it yet, but it was there like a ticking fuse waiting to announce itself. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, struggling to understand the scale of what they had stepped into. This was no accident. The pilot collapsed, the radar blackout. The mysterious passenger, all of it. Part of a sequence far larger than the crew had ever imagined, and yet Phantom 6 seemed to navigate it as if reading from a script, one he had written, the aircraft pursuing them. Inched closer, its profile now partially visible to satellite feed captured by Phantom 6 console. It bore no flag, no insignia. It was a ghost ship, a predator meant to eliminate its prey, without trace. "We have 15 minutes, said. Phantom 6, maybe." Les Reynolds asked if they should descend land reroute, but Phantom 6 only shook his head. "This plane cannot land yet." He said, "Not until we secure the package and neutralize the threat." He stood again and motioned for Miriam to follow. They exited the cockpit and began moving toward the rear of the aircraft. Reynolds remained behind, watching the horizon grow sharper on the display, and felt the weight of decisions pressing in. Miriam followed Phantom 6 past the whispering passengers, past the emergency kits, past the galley, into the reinforced access corridor that led to the cargo hold. She could feel the vibration more clearly here now, and Phantom 6 moved faster, eyes scanning the ceiling for thermal indicators. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong, and the truth lay just behind the final door ahead. He stopped in front of the biometric lock, placed his palm against the scanner, which hesitated for a split second before clicking green. The door slid open, revealing darkness within, inside. Something moved, and then everything went silent. Inside the cargo hold, the darkness felt alive. It wrapped around Miriam like smoke, thick and weighting, the kind of black that seemed to breathe as if the space itself had eyes. Phantom 6 stepped inside. First without hesitation, his footsteps barely audible against the steel floor plates. Miriam followed cautiously, her eyes struggling to adjust sensors. Overhead blinked dim red lights, barely enough to cast full shapes, but the shadows between containers seemed to shift. With each movement, the entire hold stretched long and cold, with rows of sealed crates, some stacked, some mounted to restraints, all tagged with standard military codes, and yet something was wrong, terribly wrong. The vibration she had felt before now pulsed beneath her boots like a heartbeat, mechanical, steady, unyielding. She glanced at Phantom 6, who had stopped in front of a particular crate near the center of the hold. He crouched beside it, fingers brushing across the surface, reading the serial number embossed along the edge, and then he whispered something she almost did not catch. "This one should not be here." He stood, turned, and placed his hand on a control panel mounted to the wall, activating a manual override system that disengaged the magnetic locks on the crate. The steel hinges groaned as the door creaked open. Inside lay what looked at first like standard equipment, harnesses black, tactical gear, several cases, and a thick bundle of cables coiled tight. But beneath that layer was something else, something wrapped in polymer shielding, marked with hazard indicators and radiation tags. Miriam stepped back immediately. The markings were clear enough experimental technology, something volatile, something no civilian crew should be transporting. Phantom 6 reached in and pulled the shielding away, revealing a small containment core, glowing faint blue with pulsating energy lines, threading across its surface like veins of electricity. "This is a prototype," she said quietly, though her voice was shaking. "It is more than that," he replied. "This is what they want to destroy." Reynolds' voice suddenly cracked through the intercom, his breath ragged, his words stumbling. "They're getting closer. Radar says 10 miles out. No communication. Still no identifiers, and we have no escort Phantom." 6 tapped his headset twice, then responded, "Hold position. Do not descend. Prepare the scrambler. Deploy." Protocols Delta and Echo. Reynolds hesitated, then acknowledged. Miriam turned back to the crate, her heart racing now, her voice lower. "What is that thing? What does it do?" Phantom 6 stared at the containment unit as if remembering something terrible. "It bends frequencies," he said. After a long silence, "It can hide things from satellites, from drones, even from time in short bursts, and if triggered without calibration, it could erase more than just data." Miriam felt her legs weaken as she realized. The implications this thing, whatever it was, had been buried inside their flight, hidden among crates and manifests, and had nearly slipped through unnoticed until someone decided it had to be taken out of the sky. "You said someone on board might be hostile?" she whispered. "Yes," he replied. "One of them might be a ghost." She glanced back toward the main cabin, knowing that among the passengers sat dozens of seemingly ordinary people, quiet, pale, frightened, but not all of them could be innocent, and if, even one, was waiting for the right moment to act. The entire plane was a ticking time bomb. "We need to find them," she said now before they make a move. Phantom 6 reached into the side of the crate, pulled out a compact scanner shaped like a blackened metal box with a single screen. He handed it to her. "Turn it on. It will pick up irregular signals, neural frequency spikes, proximity overrides. It can detect more than metal." She took it in both hands. The screen flickered to life, displaying the outline of the aircraft and a ripple pulse that scanned from nose to tail. In slow waves, the first scan returned normal. The second showed a slight anomaly near row 18 port side. She showed him the display, and he nodded without hesitation. They turned, moved. Quickly, through the cargo hold back through the access corridor, every second felt stretched. The vibration beneath their feet now slightly stronger. The plane shifted slightly, turbulence brushing its wings, but the course-held Phantom 6 was flying. On instinct and calculation and something deeper. Something only soldiers who had walked back from death could claim as they passed back through the main cabin. Passengers turned their heads, some startled, some curious, but none brave enough to speak. Phantom 6 moved with purpose. Miriam behind him, the scanner blinking in her hands, they reached row 18 and paused. 3 passengers sat there, a middle-aged man in a brown coat, a woman holding a baby, and a teenage boy with noise-canceling headphones. The scanner blinked again, stronger this time. Phantom 6 leaned forward, tapped the seat edge, and spoke softly but firmly. "Excuse me, sir. I need you to come with me." The man in the coat looked up confused, blinking his eyes, then slowly shaking his head. "I don't understand. Is there a problem?" Miriam looked at the scanner. The signal flared bright red, and suddenly she knew this was no ordinary man. Phantom 6 stepped closer, his posture shifting subtly now like a predator coiled. He repeated the request, but this time with the edge of command in his voice, the kind no civilian ignored. And yet the man smiled. "You're too late," he said. Phantom 6 moved instantly, hand reaching for the coat. But the man lunged backward into the aisle, pulling something from inside his jacket, a black cylindrical object, not a weapon, not a gun, but something worse, an activation key with 3 glowing indicators. Passengers screamed. The woman with the baby ducked down, dragging her child under the seat. The boy leapt sideways. Knocking his headphones off, chaos erupted. People scrambled away from row 18 seats, tore loose, bags dropped from overhead compartments. The man held the activation key out like a beacon, ready to trigger whatever was buried in the hold Phantom 6. Dove into him, like a lightning bolt, tackling him hard, both of them hitting the floor as the activation device skittered across the aisle. Miriam lunged, grabbing it before it could slide further. Her fingers closed around the cold surface. Her thumb, hovering over a red blinking button. "Do not press," that Phantom 6 yelled from the floor. The man beneath him snarled, began to twist and fight, trying to throw him off. Miriam held the device tightly, backing up slowly, her hands trembling. Passengers, pressed against the far side of the cabin, eyes wide, breaths. "Shallow, who are you?" she asked. But the man did not answer. Instead, he screamed a word. None of them understood, and from the back of the cabin another figure stood, a second ghost. This one moved, faster than expected. Heading toward the cockpit, Reynolds' voice came back over the intercom. "They're trying to breach the flight deck." Phantom 6 leapt up and shouted to Miriam, "Secure the key and follow me." He sprinted forward past the terrified passengers. Toward the cockpit, the second hostile already halfway down the aisle. Reynolds was shouting something more, but the signal was lost. Static crackled across the comm. Miriam ran after Phantom 6, keeping the device tight against her chest. She passed. The first attacker, still on the floor, restrained by two passengers who had jumped in to help. She reached the cockpit, just as Phantom 6 collided with the second figure, both of them crashing into the wall beside the door. The cockpit lock flashed. Red. The intruder had initiated a breach. Protocol. Phantom 6 threw a punch, then another, grabbing the attacker's arm and twisting the shoulder joint until something popped. The man fell, but not before slamming a second control stick into the wall. Beside the door, a hidden code, input. The cockpit door clicked once and began to open. Phantom 6 slammed his body into the entryway and forced it shut again, twisting the override panel and cutting power. He turned to Miriam, his face covered in sweat. "We have more than one problem," he said. Behind them, the attacker groaned and began to rise again. The scanner in Miriam's hand flared again, stronger than before. Multiple pulses now throughout the cabin, more than two signals, more than two operatives. The cargo hold had been a decoy. The real mission was still unfolding, and the countdown had already started. The cockpit door shook as Phantom 6 jammed the emergency lock mechanism back into place. The override panel sparked under his hand, but the door, held for now. He turned to Miriam, whose face had gone pale from the chaos and the weight of the device she still held in her hands. The activation key blinked rhythmically, casting red pulses across her fingers. It was warm now, as if the thing inside, it had begun to wake. "We need to get this to the core." Phantom 6 set his voice low and calm, even though sweat traced a line down his temple. "Every second we hold this in the cabin, we risk a proximity trigger, and if any of those ghosts out there get to the crate before us, they'll set it off manually." Reynolds emerged from the cockpit shaken and pale, and for a moment he stared at the key and then at Phantom 6, and finally at Miriam, as if seeing them for the first time and realizing that nothing about this flight was ever what it seemed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Phantom 6 cut him off. "We have 5 minutes, maybe less. We move now." Behind them, the restrained man from row 18 stirred again, and Miriam could see blood near his collar. But the look in his eyes was something else, something focused and alive. Despite the blow to his head, and the passengers who held him were already struggling to keep him down, Phantom 6 turned and pointed. "You four, keep him unconscious, or this ends badly for all of us." He and Miriam started back toward the cargo hold, the activation key secured in a reinforced satchel. She slung over her shoulder the scanner in her other hand, now pulsing with more urgency than before, as if the aircraft itself had begun to feel the pressure of the converging threats. Every step down the narrow corridor felt heavier than the last. The floor vibrated, not from turbulence but from something deeper, a rhythmic pulse running through the plane. like a code, like a countdown, like breath from a sleeping beast about to open its eyes. As they reached the hold, the overhead lights flickered once, then twice, then returned to red Phantom 6, opened the door manually, his fingers now slightly trembling. Whether from exhaustion or anticipation, she could not tell. Inside the hold, nothing had visibly changed, but she sensed the shift. The air felt thinner, as if the oxygen